Thank you. My name is Gary Scudder. I'm a professor in the Corps. Today I'm ably assisted by the excellent Alfonso Capone, who is running the film. He, like all great Italians, is a brilliant filmmaker. Now, today I want to talk about something I've actually talked about before. I want to talk about Winesburg, Ohio, specifically a short story that I use inside of Winesburg, Ohio. As I discussed before, and as every right-thinking individual knows, Winesburg, Ohio is the greatest American novel, and it cannot be denied. And I use it all throughout 110 and sometimes 130. Because you have these short, little, very concise chapters dealing normally with one individual, which allows you to focus in and tie it to a theme from Hawk or Linden or Freeland. Today I want to talk briefly about the chapter called Adventure, which is the story of poor, long-suffering Alice. And this is the first chapter that I give my students in 110. And as I've discussed before, I'm a big believer in learning a theory and then using a theory. So I'll have them read something from Linden or Hawk and then immediately have them write a paper analyzing a character from Winesburg, Ohio. So they have to actually use the theory as compared to just talk about it philosophically, even though I know my philosopher friends, and I have many of them, to my embarrassment, would just want to talk philosophically, but I'm a Hoosier, so I'm very pragmatic and simple-minded. So I like to talk specifically about a short story. So this is the story of Alice, and the short story, again, is called Adventure. And Alice is, at the time of this adventure, is 27, which in Winesburg is pretty old. Again, the story is written in 1919. And this goes back to something that happened when she was, in her late teens, and she'd fallen in love with another teenager by the name of Ned, and they had become lovers. And keep in mind, in 1919, this was a big deal. This is why, even in Sherwood Anderson's hometown of Clyde, Ohio, Winesburg, Ohio was kept behind closed doors at the library because people actually had sex, or almost had sex. And so they become lovers. And Ned leaves. I think he goes to Cleveland, he goes to Chicago. And he's always going to come back, but he never quite does. So what I have them do is they say, I might tie it to Hawk's discussion of internal, external locus of control. Or sometimes I've tied it to Hawk's discussion of cognitive dissonance. The reason why I do it first is because for some reason it really resonates with the students, and we tend to come back and talk about it again and again and again throughout the semester. People always want to talk about Alice, and no matter what we learn, they always come back and talk about Alice again. So in page 96, at least in this particular version of Winesburg, Ohio, when they actually become lovers, when they were talking about what they wanted to do, and Anderson writes, they get out of the buggy at a place where a long meadow ran down to the bank of Wine Creek, and there in the dim light became lovers. When at midnight they returned to town, they were both glad. It did not seem to them that anything that could happen in the future could blot out the wonder and beauty of the thing that had happened. And Ned says, now we will have to stick to each other. Whatever happens, we will have to do that. But of course he doesn't. He goes off to the big city, he writes, and eventually he stops writing. And Alice is left, and essentially a decade goes by as she waits for him with this feeling that he'll eventually come back. Later on she says, Anderson writes, she was glad to be employed because the daily round of toil in the store made the time of waiting seem less long and uninteresting. She began to save money, thinking that when she had saved $200 or $300, she would follow her lover to the city and try if her presence would win back his affections. She even had said to Ned that they could just go to the city and live together. He wouldn't even have to marry her, again, which is why this is such a scandalous novel in 1919. And time passes, and you find her saying things like, and this is Alice talking, I am his wife, and shall remain his wife whether he comes back or not. And keep in mind, they're never married, but Alice literally says things like this. And she gets further and further along. At one point she says, it began to occur to her that with a shiver of dread she realized that for her the beauty and freshness of youth had passed. Again, she's only 27. For the first time she felt that she had been cheated. Then when she turns 27, something happens, and she has this sort of, well, I'd like to say she has an epiphany, but I think she just has a trauma. Anderson writes, Alice took a pillow into her arms and held it tightly against her breasts. Getting out of bed, she arranged a blanket so that in the darkness, it looked like the form lying between the sheets, and kneeling beside the bed, she caressed it, whispering words over and over like a refrain. Why doesn't something happen? Why am I left here alone? She muttered, which my students tend to think, I think quite rightly, this is one of the saddest images in all of literature. Although she sometimes thought of Ned Curry, and this is interesting, she no longer depended on him. Her desire had grown vague. She did not want Ned Curry or any other man. She wanted to be loved, to have something answer the call that was growing louder and louder within her. Her big adventure, and Anderson tends to use the word adventure quite a bit, is one night she, in the midst of this almost breakdown, she runs out into the streets of Winesburg, Ohio, naked in the pouring rain, with the sense that somehow the rain will give her new life. And she sees a man coming toward her, and she says, I'm going to go give myself to him. So she starts to run to him and calls out, and he's a really old man who can't hear, sort of like me. And he's like, what? Which, of course, is a lovely metaphor for the fact that she's always yelling at life, and life never hears her. And she sort of drops to the ground and crawls back, and then bars herself in her room. And she said, what is the matter? This is the last line, and all the chapters in Winesburg, Ohio have a killer last line. And she says, what is the matter with me? I will do something dreadful if I'm not careful, she thought, and turning her face to the wall, began trying to force herself to face bravely the fact that many people must live and die alone, even in Winesburg. And I've talked before about the fact that I remember reading this when I was 14 and how it completely changed my perception of literature, and I never read anything age-appropriate again, because I thought, this is what adults talk about? My God, and it literally changed my life. And so I've always used this in class. Now, what do I do with it? Again, I had the students write short little mini essays, 250 to 350 words, specifically analyzing a story from Winesburg, Ohio, and I used about 6 or 8 different stories in the course of a typical 110 class. And they have to use a specific theory to try to make sense of it. The internal-external locus of control is a classic, because I asked the students, okay, you've now read the story in Hawk, what do you make of Alice? And you can't just tell me what you think. You have to give me specific examples from Winesburg and from Hawk to prove the point. And to tell you the truth, I don't even particularly care if they say she is internal, even though it's a really difficult argument to make. I don't care, as long as they are trying to make an argument, even a flawed one. The cognitive dissonance is a classic, especially here it says, I will be his wife no matter what. And my students are funny, because one of the really intelligent things they did one time in the course of this discussion was, one of the students said, wait a minute, this is why you always fall in love with the person that you first have sex with? Is this what cognitive dissonance means? Is this why she loves Ned, even though she can't literally remember what he looks like? Because you feel that you've done something wrong, but you don't know why you feel that. So subconsciously, you convince yourself you were in love with that person, and this is why you did it. So it works brilliantly for cognitive dissonance. I think so much of the Freeland stuff about narrative, it works well. I think the stuff with Linden about perception and memory, I think it works brilliantly. So I do this first off, and inevitably, no matter what we talk about, we always come back to Alice. And in fact, one of the practice sessions that I do for the preparation, for getting them ready to prepare their self-portrait, is I have them prepare 2 portraits of Alice. One is a portrait that they might make of Alice, and then Alice's own self-portrait. How would she express her own inner angst? So I've always used this. It always works remarkably well. As I said, the students will sometimes later on, years later, admit to their shame to me that they bought Winesburg, Ohio. And so anyway, it works very well. As always, I'm happy to talk to anyone about this, and thank you very much.